Since the advent of video games, they have come under a lot of scrutiny. They have been accused of causing direct violence, seizures, and often come with an age rating and epilepsy warning. But what if there was a game that truly had a physical effect on people, causing serious symptoms like lasting migraines, strokes, amnesia, and even death? Well, in 1981, in an arcade in Portland, Oregon, that is exactly what happened. Hi folks, I'm Johnny, welcome to The Oddest. If you're of a particular age, like me, you'll be all too familiar with the arcades of the 80s, spending your pocket money, thrashing your pals at Street Fighter, or losing your mind at the boss battles on Double Dragon. For me, being an 80s kid, my memories of the arcade are fond for sure, but for the teenagers of Portland back in 1981, their memories are not so fond. If they still have their memories. Let's see what's going on. The game is called Polybius. Insert coin. So this arcade cabinet housed a game called Polybius. Like I said in the intro, it caused players to act out, develop crazy illnesses and symptoms. It even caused fights in the arcade, and at one point one player was stabbed to death. Why would someone create such a game, and how did it just appear out of thin air? I can hear the conspiracy nuts now shouting that the government created the game as a mind control experiment. Well, actually that's exactly what it was. The game was highly addictive to say the least. Yeah, I know, most games are. And even back then, most games were. Games like Galaga, and Pac-Man. But this one was different, with its hypnotic images flashing at the screen, subliminal messages and strange soundtrack. It seems it was specifically designed for the sole purpose of messing with people's minds. The company that manufactured the game was called Sinneslotion, which is a German phrase. Translated, it means sense deleting. I know, right? After playing the game for quite some time, two Portland teenagers vanished without a trace. Some people say that they were abducted. Others say they were recruited. This game was so addictive that players would line up around the block. Often fights would break out as tensions rose for people waiting for their shot. It was reported that the game was actually watching the players as they played, recording tiny eye movements, pupillary responses, and hand-eye coordination. Now, obviously this was way before the internet, Wi-Fi, or any form of networking, so it stands to reason that someone had to physically come to the arcade to retrieve this data, right? Well, they did. Are you ready for this? Men dressed in black suits. Yep. So according to reports, these men in black would not only be recovering the memory unit from the machine, but they would replace it also so that the players could continue to play. Not only that, it's said that they would access the program of the game and change various settings to elicit any desired response. The game mysteriously showed up in two arcades in Portland at the same time and were only there for a short period, and then they vanished as inexplicably as they appeared. So it's clear that the tale of a mind control arcade game is pure urban legend, and it's one of the best ones, especially for us nostalgic nerds. They say urban legends are at least partly based on truth. So how much of this is true? Well, you'd be surprised. First of all, the company called Sinneslotion doesn't or didn't exist. The font that was used on the title screen has unusual properties also, purely because smaller companies never usually paid much attention to the font and chose not to use up the machine's memory with what would be considered advanced graphics or more pixels. Large companies like Nintendo and Williams often used higher quality specs, but then they could afford to. Some sources say that Polybius was discussed in Usenet newsgroups as early as 1994. Usenet was a very early iteration of forums and chat groups where people could post topics to be discussed. So what about the graphics of the game? Well, sources say that it was a vector-based game. So just in case not everyone watching this is a game nerd like me, what does vector graphics mean? So most older games use a bitmap graphics system that relies on resolution-based gameplay. These are called raster displays and are how a 2D image is displayed onto the screen. Vector is basically primitive geometric shapes drawn between two or more points. More specifically though, in these earlier arcade games, think of it as a mini laser show behind the screen. Vector lines are drawn between these points with an electron beam, like in the games Asteroids or Tempest. So what about the government's involvement in arcade games? Well, this is not uncommon. Back in the day, the army took a popular game called Battlezone and used it to train soldiers. This was developed by Atari and called the Bradley Trainer. What about the stories of people getting negative effects from these vector-based games? Well, that's also true. There are many cases of people getting sick and in some cases even dying. In January of 1982, a kid by the name of Michael Lopez was playing games like Tempest with his friends in Oregon. The 14-year-old began to experience flashing lights behind his eyes, and he said that when he left the arcade, he couldn't stop vomiting. Although a friend walked him home, he ended up collapsing 4 blocks from his house. Police attended and found the kid on the ground in someone else's yard. Thankfully, he made a full recovery. Also, in January a year earlier, Jeff Daly, a 19-year-old playing the game Berserk, died shortly after playing of a heart attack. In October of 82, 18-year-old Peter Burkowski also died playing the same game, also of a heart attack. Video games in the early 80s were the newest fad. Parents would revolt against their kids playing, saying that it sparks violence and all manner of negative behaviour. Bearing in mind the sole purpose of these game companies is to make money. In order to do that, they have to draw their audience in. Back then it was coins going into machines, but now it's much easier for companies to generate revenue in this way. Just look at games like Fortnite and Minecraft. Microtransactions are key. Technically it's not gambling because these content packs are sold for cosmetics purposes or maybe a new map, level or experience. What I find funny though is people are way more suspicious of governments than they are of these big game companies. But why? Do people seriously think that the government used arcade games to perform experiments on an unwitting public? Well, yes, people did think that, and still do think that. And they wouldn't be wrong. All across the United States, but in particular in Portland, the FBI set up several arcade cabinets with surveillance equipment, both audio and video. This was because arcades back then were a haven for drug dealing and illegal gambling. They performed many successful raids on these arcades. So again, remember, it's the 80s. Video surveillance equipment was not as small as it is these days. So the FBI would install the video equipment in the largest arcade cabinets that they could find. At the time, this was the game called Tempest. There were no digital recording devices or hard drives, so this footage would be recorded directly onto VHS tape. This means, of course, that agents in suits would show up, open the cabinets and retrieve the videotapes, replacing them with a blank, ready to go again. So that explains a lot, right? It was nothing more than the feds collecting their video evidence. But what about the CIA supposedly using arcade games for mind control experiments? Well, that's also true. It's no secret that during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviets were always trying to one-up each other. It was widely known that the Soviets were using drugs and other techniques to perform mind control experiments. Some considered fringe, others just downright inhumane. The CIA themselves developed a program called MK Ultra. This is a whole other video. If you've ever heard of MK Ultra, then you know what I'm talking about. In 1984, a popular sci-fi movie was called The Last Starfighter. The premise behind this retro classic is that a high school lad gets recruited via an arcade game to fight in an intergalactic war. We can see how this might be life imitating art. It's clear that the influence of this movie may have contributed to the legend of Polybius, and the fact that it's said that teenagers were going missing or being recruited for something. What about the name Polybius? Well, Polybius was a Greek historian, philosopher and creator of cryptic puzzles and codes. He was kicking it around 200 BC, and he's famous for saying that nothing should be simply believed without evidence to support it. So the strange thing is, there's no real evidence that the Polybius game ever existed. Sure, there are versions of the game that exist today developed later on, but as for the original dangerous mind-controlling arcade game, I'm afraid it's nothing more than an urban legend. A listing for the game appeared on a website called coinop.org back in 2000. This is basically a site that databases arcade games. According to the listing, the Polybius game was copyrighted in 1981, but sources say that no such copyright exists. It's believed that the owner of the website created the listing and therefore the legend in efforts to drum up traffic to his site. Kurt Koller was the chap behind coinup.org, and he's just happened to tip off a well-known game magazine called GamePro. The magazine ran an article about a secret arcade game that controls the minds of youngsters through nefarious means, and so the legend was born. So, although the story of Polybius is not technically true, it's no joke that video games and other media are developed as a form of mind control. Social media apps, Facebook, TikTok and even YouTube are designed with one thing in mind: to keep users on the platform for as long as possible. It certainly seems that everywhere we look these days, people are stuck to their mobile devices. Such things are created for being social, but really, there's nothing social about it. Likes, shares and subscriptions, that's the currency these days. I remember watching an episode of the TV show Black Mirror. It was set a short distance into the future, whereby these digital interactions govern someone's life, social status and even credit score. The more followers and likes they had, the more likely they were to get approved for loans or get a job. I don't think we're that far from that reality. So with that being said, remember to subscribe to this channel, wink. That's us come to the end of the video yet again, folks. I'm ever so grateful for each and every one of you that takes the time to watch my content. I truly wish you all the very best. Stay safe out there and remember, keep smiling.